Your call is for how many rate moves this year?
Well, the market only calls for a half over the next 12 months, and the 12 months beyond that, another half. So 12 basis points each. That's the market. I think they raise once or try to raise once, and if they continue to get employment numbers like this, and if they can get those wages up, then perhaps they'll have their chance later in the year. I think they really do want to raise rates. I think some of them, like Bullard and Evans, have a sense that they need higher interest rates in order to balance out the savings versus investment element in the economy.
And the markets come back right now. We had stronger yen, and then we had weaker yen off the shock of the report, a good report with good revisions. And then we've got the yen coming back again. Bill Gross, without question, in our lifetimes, this is the most price-to-perfection bond market we've ever seen. Has your day-to-day life changed when you see yields? I mean, the yield goes from 139 to 141. These are shocking yields and shocking bond valuations. What are you doing day-to-day within this milieu?
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's priced to perfection. I'll change that a little bit if you will permit me, Tom. It's priced to absurdity. And so, one knows that $12 trillion worth of sovereign bonds are in negative yield space. One knows that in Germany that the ECB can't really buy 40% of German bonds because they're yielding less than 40 basis points. One knows in Japan that almost everything, including the 40-year JGB, is at zero or less. And so it's an absurd market. And what do you do is the question. Well, you obviously don't buy those bonds. That's something that German banks and insurance companies have to buy because they got to put their money somewhere. And so you look for substitutes and some type of certainty. The trick in this business, Tom, is to buy the highest return relative to the risk. I would say every asset class is at risk. The question is which one is at less risk. And I think my dominant premise is that central banks will continue to do what they do, despite the fact that I disagree with it. And if that's the case, then the volatility of central bank positions, the volatility of the policy rates around the world, in the developed world, will stay relatively constant. And so you want to take advantage of that by selling optionality around it. That would include buying mortgages. That would include selling outright options. That would include, basically upping your income from something like 1.4 on a 10-year to something like 5 or 6% on an annual basis.
And to do a Janus Capital jargon alert, folks, when Mr. Gross sells options, those derivatives, that brings in an income stream to his fund to keep him in chips. Bill Gross, if I look at into the weekend and into July, into the second half, is Bill Gross looking at Janet Yellen's American world, and for that matter, a troubled Europe, is in equilibrium, or are the disequilibriums so great that you need to be vigilant for exogenous shocks?
Well, I think one must be prepared. And how fat is that fat tail? It's hard to say, but it doesn't approach a black swan, but maybe a gray swan. There are problems everywhere. I talked about the UK property situation. We know the Italian banks are now asking for a bailout as opposed to a bail-in. We're not quite sure what's going on with China, but I observed that the Chinese stock markets, basically stay level throughout the entire night, each and every night, and so one has to suspect that something's going on there. I simply think, that there's a potential problems almost everywhere in a highly levered world, and that's the key, Tom.
Okay.
When you have a highly levered world, then almost anything can set it off.
Okay, I know Mike McKee wants to get in here with a lot of questions. Let me ask one more question before we go to my colleague. Bill Gross, Ambrose Evans Pritchard wrote a brilliant article overnight in the Telegraph about China exporting their deflation over to us. Is Janet Yellen running a non-orthodox policy because she's got to accept the disinflation from China and the rest of a troubled economic world?
Well, I think she does, and certainly if she continues to talk about raising interest rates, that would make it even worse. Yes, China, as they devalue by 6 or 7% over the last 7 or 8 months, maybe 10% annualized, is exporting deflation, and some investors don't quite understand how that could be the case, but it basically means that we can buy Chinese goods much cheaper, that it basically erodes our manufacturing base as it becomes less competitive, et cetera, et cetera. And so China exports their deflation to the rest of the world. Yellen, how does she fight that? Well, she certainly doesn't fight it with a stronger dollar and with an interest rate hike. And so, yeah, I think that tempers her behavior certainly to some extent.